Today's presentation is about altering the macronutrients in the American diet, altering the macronutrients to become healthier. If you could help yourself and your family be resistant to disease, would you do it? If you could find a way to help your children grow up and be the ideal body weight that they should be as Americans based on the charts and self-esteem and feeling good and healthy about themselves, would you help them do that? If you had family members that had diseases like heart disease and diabetes, and you knew how to help them actually reverse some of their aging, reverse some of the inflammation, and help them get healthier, would you do that? What if I said it was as simple as changing what you eat? It is. Basically today what we're going to talk about is how we got into the situation today with our obesity and healthcare crisis. We're also going to talk about the information related to macronutrients, proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, and how we can change those to become better, and how to insulate ourselves and do the behaviors that make us healthier. Let's start with how we got here. Basically, the obesity crisis really ramped up in 1980. What happened in 1980 to make such a meteoric rise in body weight across our country? Basically, that was just before the first USDA guidelines for food came out from Congress. That was the first time that Congress decided to weigh in on the diet of Americans in an effort to help us to be healthier. It's interesting. Half of the American Medical Association disagreed with those guidelines. The other half, of course, were on board. We'll go into a little bit the story about how these guidelines came into place and why Congress was so motivated to do these guidelines. But first, let me read from you an editorial that the American Medical Association wrote to Congress asking for them not to do the guidelines. It was printed in 1977 because we all know that the wheels of government move slowly. So between 1977, the guidelines were finally passed and published in 1980. This is from Height and Feynman, RD, et al. In the face of contradictory evidence, the report of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans Committee. This is published in Nutrition 2010, October. So in their report about obesity, they found this editorial from the American Medical Association and reprinted it in Nutrition 2010 journal. I will read the whole thing in its entirety that I have here. We believe that it would be inappropriate at this time to adopt proposed national dietary guidelines as set forth in the report on dietary goals for the United States. The evidence for assuming that benefits to be derived from the adoption of such universal dietary goals as set forth in the report is not conclusive, and there is potential for harmful effects from a radical, long-term dietary change as would occur through the adoption of the proposed guidelines. It goes on to say, the AMA believes that there are insufficient data to recommend such changes in the diet on a nationwide scale. Wow, this almost seems prophetic that part of the AMA was saying, don't make these guidelines. We don't know what unintended consequences could have. What has happened because of these guidelines? Well, I can tell you that we haven't gotten any healthier and our weight hasn't gone down. Let me read some stats. From the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, Obesity Statistics and Tables, published 2011, found on the web. Obesity rates since 1980. 1960 to 1980, women obesity percent of the population was 15 to 17%. Pretty stable. 1988, a mere 8 years after the guidelines, it had risen to 26%. 1999, 21 years after the guidelines. Actually, 17 years after the guidelines, my fault. 34%. 2008, 35%. That is an alarming increase. Presently, right now, we have a plus 35% obesity for women in the United States. Men don't fare any better. 1960 to 1980, 10.7 to 12.8% obesity. Again, fairly stable. But as soon as 1988 came around, 8 years after the guidelines, we were already at 20.6%. 1999, 27.7, and 2008, 32%. Obesity is not stable, and we're actually not getting any healthier. We're getting more and more sick. Let's talk about the other big disease. The big disease is diabetes. All right, another statistic. Center of Disease Control and Prevention, Diabetes Data and Trends Table, published in February of 2012. What do we have? In 1980, we were getting about 493,000 people diagnosed with diabetes. By 2010, 1.7 million people diagnosed with diabetes. That's almost more than a threefold increase in diabetes diagnosis. What we have here is a new disease state that medicine is actually calling diabesity. The combination of diabetes and obesity merging together to create a vicious cycle where both diseases actually get worse. Person gains weight, becomes diabetic. The diabetes medications keeps their blood sugar low but helps them to gain more weight. Once they gain more weight, they need more medicine to control their now out of control diabetes, and it goes higher and higher. So basically this new classification is called diabesity. So we've looked and we now know by just driving down the street or going to the mall or looking at the kids hanging on the corner waiting for the bus that America is changing and we're all becoming more overweight. So we know that the crisis is here, and we know that the healthcare system can't support all these people if they continue to get more sick. But how did we get here? What rang the alarm for Congress to actually change our dietary guidelines, or actually even at first get involved with the dietary guidelines? It actually had a lot to do with doctors doing autopsies of people in the 50s. And they were finding that right after World War II, they were doing these autopsies and the men were having advanced arterial sclerosis, basically heart disease. Somehow, science, maybe part of the American Medical Association, attributed that to fat. That is poor science. That's what we call in science a poor causality, that they can tie that relationship together. Well, let's look at that. Let's look at some of the foodstuffs that was going on in that era. I'm going to be quoting from the Nourishing Traditions, written by Sally Fallon and published in the 1990s. And she used in her book the USDA stats that she found concerning food intakes for the general American population. Between 1910 and 1970, animal fat consumption dropped by 25%. Butter consumption dropped by 77%. Some things went up. Trans fat, which is a man-made form of fat, which is cheaper, obviously, and also has inflammatory processes and is easier to handle and put into foodstuffs, went up by 400%. Sugar intake rose by 60%. But even with that, we didn't have obesity. We just had heart disease. Heart disease went from 1910 as 1% of our population to 1970 being 50% of our population as a cause of mortality. So the statistics are that heart disease was rising. What's the poor science is that we're attributing it solely to our food. When our animal fat, saturated fat, and our butter, another saturated fat, were going down, we were actually getting more disease. Yet Congress and the U.S. Department of Agriculture tied it to fat intake. What else was going on in the United States at that time? Between 1910 and 1970, we were involved with World War I, World War II. the Korean conflict, the Vietnam War. Most of the men of that era between 1910 and 1970 saw combat, or we all knew somebody that saw combat. So what was going on? When we look at heart disease was not becoming a major player with women until the 80s. So most of these heart disease cases were men. And you're talking about sampling men and doing autopsies on them as they died or had a catastrophic heart attack on men that had been in foxholes, bombs bursting around them, smoking, eating MREs, meals ready to eat from a can, for months on end. Cortisol and inflammatory hormones pumping into their body because of the stress that they're in, basically fighting for their lives each and every day. Long marches, slogs, living under harsh conditions. And they're tying it only to fat when that whole environmental factor and stress factor was there as well. So it is poor science to attribute the heart disease solely to the food things, because it wasn't proven that fat was the culprit. Now that we've looked at what was actually going on and why the alarm bells were sounded for Congress, Congress looked at these autopsies and the men dying and the ill health, and they tied it to fat and decided to create food guidelines that would recommend lowering the fat intake and what we called then carving meat in our daily diet, and see if we could stem the tide of illness. Apparently, the law of unintended consequences has asserted itself, because it has not worked out the way everybody thought it would. I actually, as an anecdotal piece of information, went out in 2012 to a seminar in Denver, Colorado called the Nutrition and Metabolism Symposium, where all of the researchers basically got up on stage, medical doctors and PhDs, and said, literally, one of them apologized, we were wrong. Telling people to reduce fat and increase carbohydrates from fat-free sources was the bad move. We made a horrible mistake, and now we have to fix it. It was quite refreshing to see medical doctors from Duke University say we were wrong. So now, let's talk a little bit about what's going on with our macronutrients and educate ourselves a little bit more about what's happening. Protein has 4 calories per gram. And a calorie is a unit of measurement that when you flip something over and look at the calories per serving, that unit of measurement is how we determine how much energy is in it. So 4 calories per gram of protein. Carbohydrate also has 4 calories per gram. Fat has 9 calories per gram. So this is where Congress and the powers that be thought that if we cut down our fat intake, let's say by 50%, we're going to cut down 4.5 calories per gram. But we also got hungrier. There was less protein in our diet. There was less fat in our diet. So what did we do? We increased our carbohydrate intake. Please do not assume that I'm against carbohydrates. I eat them every day. I eat them at 4 different meals per day, and I need them for workouts. And ask Rachel if she needs carbohydrates, and she's going to say yes, she does for her workouts. But we don't need as many as we take in. So we have these grams of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. The recommended allowance for protein is about 1 calorie per gram. In an athlete, it's about 1.2 calories per gram, per kilo. 1.2 grams per kilo. So about a gram per pound, half a gram per pound. When you're looking at athletes, they might need a little bit more protein, but the recommended daily allowance is based on a negative criteria for almost all nutritional products. What do we mean a negative criteria? It is not for optimal health. It is for not presenting a disease state. So when it says that you only need 100 milligrams or 200 milligrams of vitamin C, It's so that you and I don't get scurvy, which is the disease of low vitamin C. We've all heard the stories when we were growing up in grade school about the sailors who would need to eat lemons, limes, and oranges. That prevented them from getting scurvy. By no means would I suggest that that gave them optimal health. So the negative criteria is what the USRDA is basing it on, and the same thing goes for protein. It is the amount of protein that normal people can present and be positive nitrogen balance, which means that you're at least taking in what you're turning over for protein. The problem is that leaves far too many calories for carbohydrates. Let's look at that. I'm hoping that you can see this chart that I'm going to hold up, but I will talk about it in a minute. But it's basically the math associated with a female athlete. I'll hold it up here so you can read it, but basically it is the discussion about a 120-pound female athlete. If you base it on 1.2 grams per kilo of body weight, she needs about, I think, 54, let me try to turn this around. She needs about 65 grams of protein on the second line. And if you do the math, 65 grams of protein times 4 calories, it comes out to a whopping 261 calories from protein. Her diet is 2,200 calories per day. At 20% fat, 440 calories are coming from fat, and that is totally appropriate. But look at the line underneath. Remaining calories is 1,500. So based on this equation, this female athlete will be taking in 1,500 calories from carbohydrates because she had 261 from protein and 440 from fat. Simply put, it is almost more than double any of the other sources, and it's almost double the other two sources combined. Protein and fat combined, the carbohydrates are still more than double. Simply put, that's not the best way to run an athlete, nor is it the best way to run our population. We are taking in protein for the wrong reasons. Simply to maintain nutritional nitrogen balance isn't the only reason we should be looking to take in protein. Protein does a lot more for our body. Protein actually keeps food in our stomach longer before it flows into the small intestine. Well, if I keep food in my stomach longer while the protein is broken down into its constituent parts, the carbohydrates that I ate with the protein stay in my stomach longer. It basically delays gastric emptying so that you feel fuller longer. Two things happen from that. It keeps you less hungry, you stay fuller longer, you actually have protein and carbohydrates coming into the small intestine together, which blocks some of the carbohydrate absorption. So your blood sugar doesn't go up as fast. It now goes up like this instead of like this. And because your blood sugar is more stable, it's actually keeping your risks for diabetes lower. So protein stabilizes your blood sugar, delays gastric emptying, and keeps you fuller longer. So we need to make sure that our macronutrient protein is being taken in often enough and in the right amount. Fat usually comes with our proteins. If you're having steak or if you're having pork or chicken or eggs, there's always an inherent piece of fat in there. We don't worry about that. We actually tell people in our clinic to not worry about fat in general if you use it as a condiment. So you will never hear me saying that I won't allow people having butter, or I won't allow them to have olive oil and dressings on their salads if they're olive oil based. They're excellent sources of good, healthy fats. Fats are not the issue. And in fact, we will even on another topic maybe discuss how cholesterol from your food isn't really part of the cholesterol crisis in your body. There's a whole nother inflammation process. But Using fat as a condiment source and having a little bit in your diet along with the fat that comes with your protein, both of those macronutrients will create satiety, help to delay gastric emptying, and stabilize your blood sugar. Now, the carbohydrates will be actually metered in a timely fashion to control our hunger and also to give us some energy. We want to talk a little bit about foods that people assume are proteins but aren't. And we're going to try to flesh out for us what the actual best proteins are. So I see a lot of patients in our clinic trying to lose weight, obviously, and they come in telling me the proteins that they eat and want to know where they fit into their diet. Let's look at some of the protein sources that they say they have. So one of my all-time favorites is this beautiful little bar here, which, as you can see, is a Special K high protein bar. Let's face it, this is not a Special K high protein bar. This is a Special K candy bar that has on its label some protein. Most protein sources from these bars come from soybeans. This one also has a little bit of peanut butter in it, but of course it's covered in chocolate. And if we look at the calories on this, we know that it has 180 calories per serving, the bar, and 25 grams of carbohydrate. And all of the proteins in here are incomplete. People buy Special K high protein bars and eat them and then tell themselves they're taking in protein, but they're actually taking in almost a sugar stick. This is not stabilizing your blood sugar. This is not stabilizing your appetite and your gastric emptying. It's a candy bar that we're basically being told is a healthy alternative. It is not. Let's go on to something different. How many people think that peanut butter is a protein? It's not. Peanut butter is peanut butter and is more closely associated to being a fat than it is a protein. Now, you didn't hear me say that there wasn't protein in here, and you didn't hear me say that there wasn't protein in here. But let's take peanut butter for an example. All right, 2 tablespoons is a serving, and there's 200 calories per tablespoon. Okay, there is a whopping 7 grams of protein per 2 tablespoons, or 3.5 grams of protein per 1 tablespoon. But 7 times 4, remember, 7 grams times 4 calories per gram. The last time I checked, 4 times 7 was 28. So out of 200 calories per serving, 28 calories come from protein. The rest comes from fat. So 178 calories in your serving are coming from fat. I have nothing against fat. Fat is perfectly appropriate in your diet. It's actually not the reason why we're gaining weight. It has not any hormonal push towards gaining weight. But understand that you can't count this as a protein. It's mostly a fat. If people want a little bit of peanut butter on their toast in the morning instead of a little swipe of butter, it's totally okay. I would approve of either one, as long as that meal has an appropriate amount of quality protein. What's quality protein at breakfast for me? Every morning I have 1 egg. I have a half a cup of egg substitute and 2 slices of Canadian bacon, also known as very lean ham, with my toast or with my oatmeal. I gotta get the protein to stabilize the carbohydrates. Peanut butter is not a protein. It is mostly a fat with a little bit of proteins sprinkled in. The other big source for protein, especially for vegans, is our favorite beans. Now, this is a can of chickpeas, which is known as garbanzo beans, because I'll actually eat these in my salad, so I figured I'd buy them to show you. But what I want you to understand is that beans are not really a protein. They're very much like peanut butter. Peanut butter is mostly a fat, but beans are mostly a carbohydrate. So let's look at the label. For a half a cup, it's about 100 calories. There is 5 grams of protein in that half cup. 5 times 4, 20. 20 calories per half cup from protein. There's 17 grams of carbohydrates per half cup. It's mostly a carbohydrate. So, what do we eat with beans? Most people eat rice and beans. So rice and beans is a carbohydrate with an even more refined carbohydrate of being the rice on top of it. If you eat that for dinner, you're basically pouring sugar into your bloodstream before bed. I'm not getting in the way of anybody's cultural habits, but that cultural habit is causing diabetes in the Hispanic population, probably to the tune of 700% increase in the last 30 years. I don't have a citation for that, but I have read that in the past. I see that in our clinic all the time. The population that we get coming in with diabetes is most prevalently the Hispanic on a high carbohydrate, low fat diet. So beans, again, are a carbohydrate with a little bit of protein. These foods are healthy. They're fine for you, but they aren't complete proteins. What are complete proteins? They swim, they fly, they run. They come from a mother. I am not trying to deny people their right to vegetarianism, but I do want to explain how the body works. Swimming, fish, flying, chicken and turkey, steak, pork, eggs, cottage cheese, Greek yogurts of some type that aren't sweetened are all viable sources of protein. And if you take these proteins in, each meal, you will stabilize the flow of carbohydrates into your body. It will make a profound impact on your body for lowering your weight, curtailing your risk for diabetes, and lowering the overall inflammation. Of course, your diet should have a lot of fibrous vegetables, cruciferous vegetables, salads, broccoli, asparagus, green beans, cauliflower, zucchini, squash, spinach, Brussels sprouts, carrots, just to name a few. These should round out the bulk of your diet, and we try to get in our clinic the patients to eat at least 1 vegetable every day and multiple salads. But you really want to change your diet going into the evening. So now let me give you the recipe so that you can help yourself and your family be healthier and lose weight and have a vibrant lifestyle into the future. 5 meals a day. Always eat breakfast. Breakfast, snack, lunch, snack, dinner. Breakfast has protein of high quality with some carbohydrates. Snack, a little bit smaller than breakfast. Snack has protein, carbohydrate, maybe a fruit or a vegetable, a little bit smaller portions, but the proteins and the carbohydrates are equal. It's not this much carbohydrate to this much protein. Keep them equal. Lunch, your last really big meal containing carbohydrates. Again, about the size of breakfast, couple of servings of protein, couple of servings of carbohydrate. They can come from potato, pasta, rice, bread, cereals, corn, peas are carbohydrates. You can eat those too. I even use beans as my carbohydrates in a salad. But it's a big meal. Throw a fruit in there as well. But think of lunch between 12 and 1 as the last big meal. Now, 3 to 4 hours after lunch, eat a snack. This is the most important meal of the evening. If you don't eat the snack, you will be hungry for dinner. What's a snack? 5 ounces of cottage cheese and some peaches or a plum, rolled up ham slices and an apple or a pear. That's simple. Nothing major. It's simply to bridge you from lunch to dinner. And without that bridge meal, you run the risk of coming in and being ravenous. Now you're going to reach for chips and wheat thins and crackers and a soda, or in my case, a beer, and you're going to be hungry. This is not what you want to do, because now when you come home for dinner, you're going to have a nice big piece of swim, fly, or run. You're going to have multiple vegetables, asparagus and green beans, or carrots and broccoli, something fibrous, cook them any way you like. Put a little oil and put some spices on them, adobo and garlic and herb Mrs. Dash, and bake them in the oven. It doesn't matter. And a big salad made with olive oil dressing. It's a big dinner, but there's no high energy foods in it. What better way to end your day knowing that you ate a food system that was going to help you burn into the evening and maybe all the way till breakfast? That's the way to lose weight, is to control your macronutrients, control your inflammation, and control your blood sugar so that you're eating high density foods with more energy earlier in the day. And as you loop around to breakfast time, while you're sleeping, you're actually burning. We help people get off their diabetes medication at our clinic. We help people lose hundreds of pounds, but they have to make the changes in their life. And you have the opportunity to make changes in your life and your family's life to reduce inflammation and help everybody get vibrant and active. Remember the 3 recipes: food, what you take in and how you nutrify your body; activity keeps your bones and muscles thermogenically moving and helps you to burn body fat and stay healthy; and sleep. But if you take the recipes that we just went over for food, you're going to lose weight, you're going to have more energy, you're going to feel fantastic about yourself, and you could be the start of helping to change our country's healthcare crisis today. I want to close with saying how much I enjoyed this class with you and seeing your presentations and watching us all grow as speakers and becoming more comfortable in front of the camera. And I look forward to seeing you in the classes and hallways of Goodwin, and hoping for great success and a healthy lifestyle for all of you. Take care.